Hi guys, and welcome to another 7-minute lecture. The subject I want to cover today is as controversial as it is important. It's something which looms a very large shadow over international politics, and yet very few know the actual backdrop to it. I'm talking, of course, about the Sunni-Shia divide in the Muslim world. As most of you know, Middle Eastern politics is a topic of great interest to the rest of the world. If something happens in that part of the world, all of us hear about it, regardless of whether we are in the Western Hemisphere or Eastern one. And while most people are aware that this dichotomy exists, they don't seem quite too sure what exactly the difference is. So let me attempt to give you a historical context to that. In a nutshell, the difference between the two sects inside Islam first boil down to who the successor of the Prophet Muhammad is. The Shia community insists that his successor is Ali ibn Abi Talib, who was the Prophet's cousin and son-in-law and even grew up in the Prophet's house. Ali was one of Muhammad's most trusted friends and confidants during what is known as the Hijrah or the migration in 622 AD, where Muhammad and his supporters were basically forced out of Mecca and had to flee to Medina. Ali was one of those loyal to the Prophet and even married his daughter Fatima later that year. He even earned the nickname the Lion of God for his military exploits, right? So the Prophet was the messenger of God and Ali was the Lion of God. That was how close the two of them were. In the next decade or so, the Prophet's teaching had spread throughout the Arab Peninsula, and through a combination of both religion and warfare, Islam had established a very strong presence in the entire region in less than 10 years. The first major complication comes during the Prophet's last pilgrimage when he was quite sick. While he was traveling through the coastal city of Ghadir Qum, which is in modern day Saudi Arabia, the Prophet basically made a speech and raised Ali's hand, saying, anyone who has me as his Mawla should consider Ali as his Mawla as well. And this is where the problem begins, because the word Mawla has multiple meanings. It can mean leader and it can also mean friend. So the Shia say this was an event where the Prophet officially designated Ali as his successor, while the Sunnis say, look, Mawla just means friend, and that the Prophet was simply declaring his friendship to Ali and honoring him as a friend. So they don't really recognize this as a succession at all. On his deathbed a few months later, it's said that the Prophet had asked for a pen and paper in order to prevent a succession war from breaking out, for him to write down his final thoughts. But that some of his close companions said, we have the Quran to guide us, and we don't know what transpired there, but all we do know is that Muhammad was never really given that pen and paper to declare what his final sort of word was. The Shias claim that he was about to appoint Ali as his successor, while the Sunnis claim that he wanted the Muslim community to decide what the line of succession would be. The story doesn't end there, obviously. So after the Prophet's death, there were numerous fights and battles between the two sides, with one wanting Ali to take over as the successor and another faction wanting Abu Bakr, the Prophet's father-in-law, through his daughter Aisha, to take over. So the Sunnis basically want Abu Bakr as the successor. Ali was not present when the Prophet died and therefore wasn't a part of the discussions that took place over the succession. So by the time he arrived, the powers that be had already decided that Abu Bakr would be the caliph, which basically meant the leader of the caliphate, the Islamic world, the Muslim world. Ali accepted Abu Bakr as the rightful caliph, which the Sunnis say is proof that Abu Bakr is the rightful successor, while the Shias say Ali was beaten and blackmailed into accepting the succession. So that's the gist of it, even though a lot more happens after that as well. To paraphrase, the Sunnis believe that Abu Bakr is the rightful successor, while the Shias believe that Ali ibn Abi Talib is the rightful successor. So why is all this relevant to us? Why should we care over what happened over 1,000 years ago and over this confusion over a single word? Simply put, This rivalry plays a huge role in modern politics, even today. Often people look at the Middle East and they are unable to understand or make sense of it because they underestimate the role of this dynamic, of this rivalry. The Shia Sunni divide has prevented the Muslim community in the Middle East from putting up any kind of united front against external enemies. And this still plays a huge role in keeping them sort of fragmented and oppressed. Many like to blame the Americans, even more like to blame the Israelis for the state of the Middle East. But the truth is that this hostility between the Sunnis and Shias, this is what has really kept them down. Saudi Arabia and Iran hate each other to this day because the former is the de facto leader of the Sunnis, while the latter is the same for the Shias. Civil wars in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Yemen, all of these to this day can be traced down to the Sunni-Shia rivalry. The Houthi rebels right now in Yemen are Shia, while the Yemen government is Sunni. The Syrian rebels are Sunni, while the Syrian government, that is the Assad regime, is Shia. Hezbollah is a Shia militant group, while ISIS is a Sunni militant group. Sometimes they band together against mutual enemies like Israel, but more often than not, they fight and kill each other in places like Lebanon and Iraq. So you cannot underestimate and understand Middle Eastern politics if you don't understand these distinctions. And any attempt to simply see them all as Muslims or as the Islamic world, and any attempt to treat them as some kind of monolithic or homogeneous entity, any such analysis will always fall flat on its face, as most Western analyses do, because these intricacies are very rarely factored in. So we should keep that in mind when we read the papers and we try to make sense of what happens in the Middle East these days. So that's it for the lecture, guys. I hope you found that useful. If you enjoy content like this, please don't forget to share and subscribe. Thank you, take care, and I'll see you soon.